On February 13, 1945, a 21-year-old factory worker from Chicago solved a tactical problem in 4 minutes that had killed 12 American paratroopers and wounded 18 others over 3 days of fighting. Private First Class Manuel Perez Jr. did not charge the pillbox. He did not sacrifice himself in a moment of desperate courage. Instead, he built a trap so elegant, so mechanically precise, that 18 Japanese soldiers died choosing between 2 different deaths while 160 American lives were saved. 29 days later, a sniper's bullet would find Perez on a nameless hillside, and the Medal of Honor that was pinned to his uniform would be cold comfort to a mother who would never again hear her son's voice. This is the story of the deadliest 4 minutes at Fort William McKinley, and the man who turned applied violence into engineering. The air above Manila Bay hung thick and wet on the morning of February 13, 1945. At 8:17 in the morning, the temperature had already climbed to 82 degrees Fahrenheit with humidity pressing down at 78%. The kind of heat that made every piece of equipment feel 10 pounds heavier, that turned rifle slings into instruments of torture against sunburned necks, that left salt rings on every uniform and made canteens empty too fast. Private First Class Manuel Perez Jr. moved through this heat like he had moved through the factory floors of Chicago, with the economical motion of a man who understood that wasted effort cost you at the end of a long shift. But this was not Chicago, and the cost of wasted motion here was not fatigue. It was death. Fort William McKinley sprawled across the southern approaches to Manila like a statement of imperial intention. Built by the United States Army at the turn of the century, the fort had been designed as the anchor of American military power in the Philippines. Its parade grounds had once hosted dress reviews and ceremonies. Its barracks had housed regiment after regiment of peacetime soldiers. Its officers' quarters had been the scene of garden parties and formal dinners. All of that belonged to another world now. The Japanese had held Fort McKinley since 1942, and they had spent 3 years transforming it from a showcase of American power into a fortress of interlocking fields of fire, reinforced pillboxes, hidden tunnels, and carefully registered artillery positions. Every building had been turned into a bunker. Every wall had been fortified, every intersection commanded by machine guns. The fort was not merely defended, it was weaponized. The 11th Airborne Division had been given the mission of taking Fort McKinley as part of the larger Battle of Manila. The paratroopers of the 11th had already fought their way south from Tagaytay Ridge, had already taken Nichols Field in brutal house-to-house fighting, and now they faced the last major Japanese strongpoint blocking the southern approach to the city. Company A of the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment had been assigned a specific objective within the fort, a cluster of reinforced positions anchoring the eastern defensive line. The company had been in contact with the enemy for 3 days. 3 days of probing attacks. 3 days of casualties mounting without progress. 3 days of watching men disappear into the meat grinder of a defensive position that seemed impossible to crack. The problem was a pillbox. Not just any pillbox, but a masterwork of defensive engineering that sat at the junction of 3 critical approaches. The structure itself was built from reinforced concrete 8 inches thick, with walls that had been further strengthened by sandbags and earth packed around the exterior. The firing ports were 18 inches wide, just enough space for the muzzles of 2 Type 92 heavy machine guns that commanded intersecting fields of fire covering every possible avenue of approach. The Japanese crew inside had ammunition, water, and the absolute certainty that they were sitting in the strongest position on the battlefield. They could not be flanked because the approaches on either side were mined. They could not be bypassed because they covered the only route forward. They could not be suppressed by rifle fire because the walls were too thick and the firing ports too narrow. Every attempt to advance toward the pillbox had ended the same way, with American bodies torn apart by interlocking machine gun fire and the survivors crawling back under cover to count their dead. Company A had already lost 12 men killed trying to take that pillbox. 18 more had been wounded, some of them crippled for life, some of them dying slowly in aid stations because the wounds were too severe and the morphine could only do so much. The mathematics were brutal and simple. At this rate, the entire company would be destroyed before the pillbox fell. The officers knew it. The sergeants knew it. Every man who looked at that concrete fortress knew it. Something had to change or the mission would fail and more men would die for nothing. Manuel Perez Jr. had been born in Oklahoma City in 1923. His father, Manuel Perez Sr., had crossed the border from Mexico seeking work and a better life, the same dream that had drawn millions of immigrants to American shores. The family had eventually settled in Chicago, where Manuel Sr. found work in the factories and raised his children in a neighborhood where Spanish and English mixed in the streets, and the smell of tortillas competed with the smoke from industrial chimneys. Manuel Jr. had grown up American but never quite allowed to forget he was Mexican-American, always aware that he would have to work harder and prove himself more thoroughly than the Anglo boys who lived a few blocks over. He had worked in a factory before the war, learning the same lessons his father had taught him. Show up on time, work harder than expected, never complain, let your results speak for themselves. When Manuel Perez Jr. had volunteered for the Paratroopers, he had walked into a world that initially did not know what to make of him. The airborne was elite, selective, demanding. It asked men to jump out of perfectly good airplanes and then fight outnumbered behind enemy lines. It attracted a certain type of volunteer, men who wanted to prove something to themselves or the world. Perez fit that category, but he also carried the additional weight of representing his people in a military that still harbored deep prejudices. Mexican Americans in World War II served in disproportionate numbers relative to their population, and they died in disproportionate numbers too. They served knowing that the country they fought for did not always treat them as full citizens, that they would return to neighborhoods where they were not welcome and jobs they could not have. But they served anyway, and men like Manuel Perez Jr. served with a distinction that forced even the most prejudiced observer to respect their capability. Perez had earned his place as point man through consistent performance under fire. Being on point was not an honor anyone sought. The point man walked first, saw the enemy first, died first. But the point man was also the most trusted, the most capable, the one who set the pace and made the split-second decisions that kept everyone else alive. Company commanders did not put mediocre soldiers on point. They put their best men there because a good point man was worth 10 average riflemen in the chaos of close combat. Perez had proven himself again and again in the fighting from Tagaytay Ridge to Nichols Field. He moved through hostile terrain with an instinct that seemed supernatural, but was actually the product of intense focus and tactical awareness. He read ground like other men read books. He understood cover and concealment at a level that went beyond training, reaching into something closer to art. On the morning of February 13th, after 3 days of watching his company bleed against that pillbox, Manuel Perez Jr. told his commanding officer that he had a solution. The officer, exhausted and desperate and down to half strength, listened. Perez did not propose a frontal assault. He did not suggest more men or heavier weapons or artillery support. Instead, he described something that sounded almost absurdly simple, the kind of plan that makes perfect sense once someone explains it, but seems invisible until that moment of clarity arrives. Perez proposed to force the Japanese defenders to make an impossible choice. Die from a grenade they could see coming or die from a grenade they could not see until it was too late. The officer approved the plan immediately, partly because it was brilliant and partly because nothing else had worked and men were dying. Perez prepared for the assault with the methodical care of a craftsman approaching difficult work. He checked his rifle, an M1 Garand that had been his companion through every firefight since landing in the Philippines. He checked his grenades, Mark II fragmentation models that weighed 21 ounces each and could kill anything within a 5-yard radius when detonated. He checked his web gear, making sure every item was secured but accessible. He checked his boots, knowing that a twisted ankle or a stumble at the wrong moment would mean death. And then, with everything ready, he began to move forward toward the pillbox that had already killed 12 of his friends. The approach to the pillbox required Perez to cross 40 yards of open ground that was completely covered by Japanese fire. 40 yards is not far. A man can sprint 40 yards in perhaps 6 seconds if he is running on a track in good conditions. But this was not a track, and these were not good conditions. Every inch of that 40 yards had been pre-registered by the machine gunners inside the pillbox. They knew the exact range to every piece of cover, every depression in the ground, every potential position an attacker might use. They had fired thousands of rounds in practice, adjusting their aim, learning the dead spaces and the kill zones. The ground itself bore the scars of previous assaults, cratered by grenades and artillery, littered with spent shell casings and the darker stains where men had bled out waiting for evacuation. Perez did not sprint. Instead, he moved in a low crawl that kept his body pressed against the earth, using every ripple in the terrain for cover. The technique was something every infantry soldier learned in training but few mastered under fire. It required absolute control of your body and your fear. The natural instinct when being shot at is to run, to get up and move fast and get to cover as quickly as possible. But that instinct gets you killed. The low crawl is agonizingly slow, and every second spent in the open feels like an hour. Your mind screams at you to move faster. But Perez had learned to ignore that voice. He moved with deliberate precision, never rising more than a few inches off the ground, pausing when necessary, advancing when the moment was right. The Japanese machine gunners spotted him almost immediately. That was inevitable. What mattered was that they could not get a clear shot. Every time they adjusted their fire to track his position, Perez had already moved to a new piece of cover or pressed himself into a depression in the ground that put him below their line of fire. The sound of machine gun fire is difficult to describe to anyone who has not experienced it in combat. It is not the neat stuttering burst you hear in movies. It is a tearing sound, like the air itself is being ripped apart. The bullets crack as they pass overhead, creating sonic booms in miniature. When they strike near you, they kick up dirt and stone fragments that slash exposed skin and fill your mouth with grit. Perez crawled through this environment for what must have felt like an eternity, but was actually 17 minutes of continuous movement under fire. When Perez reached a position approximately 20 yards from the pillbox, he paused to assess the situation. 20 yards was close enough to throw a grenade with accuracy, but far enough that the concrete walls would protect the defenders if he simply lobbed grenades at the firing ports. The Type 92 machine guns continued firing, searching for him, trying to pin him down so other defenders could maneuver against him. Perez could see the muzzle flashes from inside the pillbox, could calculate the exact position of each weapon from the pattern of fire. This was the information he needed. This was the foundation of his trap. The brilliance of Perez's plan lay in understanding the limitations of the pillbox design. The structure was strong, nearly impervious to small arms fire, well-positioned to dominate the battlefield. But it had one critical weakness. The defenders could only see what was directly in front of their firing ports. Their field of vision was limited by the 18-inch openings in 8-inch thick walls. They could see the battlefield. They could not see the exterior walls of their own position. And Manuel Perez Jr. intended to exploit that blind spot with lethal efficiency. Perez pulled a Mark II fragmentation grenade from his web gear. The Mark II was affectionately known as a pineapple grenade because of the segmented iron body designed to produce fragments upon detonation. The fuse delay was 4 to 5 seconds from the moment the safety lever was released. 4 to 5 seconds was enough time to throw the grenade a considerable distance, but not enough time to throw it, and then take cover if you were very close to the impact point. Perez pulled the pin, released the lever, counted precisely to 3, and threw the grenade directly at the nearest firing port. The defenders inside saw it coming. They saw an armed grenade arcing toward their position with perhaps 1 or 2 seconds remaining before detonation. And they did exactly what any rational person would do. they ducked away from the opening, moving back into the interior of the pillbox where the concrete walls would protect them from the blast and fragmentation. While the defenders were focused on the grenade they could see, while they were scrambling away from the firing ports, while their attention was completely fixed on the immediate threat in front of them, Manuel Perez Jr. was already moving. He sprinted the final 20 yards to the pillbox in the time it took for that first grenade to detonate. The explosion was ear-splitting, a concussive wave that hammered the air and sent fragments whining off in every direction. But Perez was not caught in the blast because he was already pressed against the exterior wall of the pillbox itself, standing in the one place on the battlefield where the defenders could not see him and could not shoot him. The trap was set. The defenders inside the pillbox had to make a choice: stay away from the firing ports where they were safe from grenades thrown at the openings but blind to what was happening outside, or return to the firing ports where they could see and shoot but expose themselves to the next grenade thrown at the opening. While they were making that decision, while they were processing what had just happened and trying to understand the tactical situation, Manuel Perez Jr. pulled another grenade from his web gear. This time he did not throw it at the firing ports. Instead, he pulled the pin, released the lever, counted to 3, and dropped the armed grenade through the firing port into the interior of the pillbox itself. Inside that reinforced concrete box, in a space perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet, an armed fragmentation grenade detonated among men who had no cover and nowhere to run. The effect was catastrophic. Fragments ricocheted off the concrete walls, turning the interior into a killing box where every surface became a source of deadly projectiles. Men were shredded where they stood. The sound of the detonation, already devastating in open air, was amplified inside the confined space into something that ruptured eardrums and caused immediate disorientation. The pressure wave alone was enough to cause internal injuries even before the fragments tore through flesh and bone. Perez did not wait to assess the results. He moved immediately to the next firing port and repeated the process: pull pin, release lever, count to 3, drop grenade through opening, move to next position. The execution was mechanical, precise, emotionless. This was not rage or revenge. This was applied violence as engineering, the reduction of a tactical problem to its most efficient solution. The second grenade detonated, then the third, then the fourth. Perez moved around the exterior of the pillbox with the systematic thoroughness of a man checking machinery. Except the machinery he was dismantling was a defensive position, and the checking process involved high explosives. The entire assault, from the moment Perez threw the first grenade at the firing port to the moment the guns inside the pillbox fell silent, lasted 4 minutes. 4 minutes during which Manuel Perez Jr. moved in the blind spots, exploited the limitations of the defensive design, and systematically destroyed a position that had held up an entire company for 3 days. When the last grenade detonated and the shooting stopped, 18 Japanese soldiers were dead inside that pillbox. 18 men who had believed they were in an impregnable position. 18 men who had killed 12 Americans and wounded 18 more. 18 men who died because they had to choose between 2 threats and chose wrong. The silence after combat is a particular kind of quiet. It is not peaceful. It is the absence of something that was recently overwhelming, and in that absence you become aware of sounds you could not hear before. The ringing in your ears from the explosions, your own breathing harsh and rapid, the small sounds of equipment settling, the groans of wounded men. In that silence, Manuel Perez Jr. stood outside the pillbox that had been the linchpin of the Japanese defensive line and assessed the results of his work. The firing ports that had spat death for 3 days were now dark and quiet. The machine guns that had torn apart charging paratroopers were now silent. The position that had seemed impregnable was now a tomb. Company A moved forward past the destroyed pillbox and continued the attack. The removal of that single strong point broke the entire defensive line. Without the interlocking fields of fire from the pillbox, the other Japanese positions became vulnerable to flanking attacks. One by one they fell or were abandoned as the defense collapsed. By the end of the day on February 13th, Company A had achieved its objective and seized its assigned sector of Fort William McKinley. The cost had been high, but it would have been catastrophically higher without Perez's intervention. Later, when the battalion staff conducted their after-action analysis, they calculated that approximately 160 American lives had been saved by the elimination of that pillbox. 160 men who would have died in continued frontal assaults against a position that showed no signs of weakening. The recommendation for Manuel Perez Jr.'s Medal of Honor came from an unusual source. Initially, the company commander had intended to put Perez in for the Silver Star, the nation's third highest award for valor. But the division headquarters informed the company that they had already filled their quota of Silver Stars for the month. This was the reality of military bureaucracy even in the middle of a brutal campaign. Awards were rationed, parceled out according to allocations and quotas that had nothing to do with the actual deeds being recognized. The company commander, frustrated by this arbitrary limitation, decided that if headquarters would not approve a Silver Star for actions that clearly warranted it, he would submit a recommendation for the Medal of Honor instead. The Medal of Honor had no quota. It could not be rationed by staff officers counting decorations like requisitions for ammunition. If Perez's actions were not worth a Silver Star because of bureaucratic limits, then they would be evaluated at the highest level, where the only consideration was whether the deed met the standard of valor above and beyond the call of duty. The Medal of Honor is not awarded lightly. It requires multiple levels of review and approval, with witnesses providing sworn statements and senior officers examining every detail of the recommended action. The standard is not merely courage under fire, which is expected of every soldier in combat. The standard is extraordinary heroism, a willingness to risk death when survival would have been understandable, an impact on the battle that goes beyond individual survival to affecting the mission outcome. Manuel Perez Jr.'s actions at Fort William McKinley met every aspect of that standard. He had advanced alone toward a position that had already killed a dozen men. He had exposed himself to enemy fire for 17 minutes while crawling across 40 yards of open ground. He had executed a tactical solution that required him to stand in the beaten zone of enemy machine guns while armed grenades detonated around him. And he had eliminated a position that was holding up an entire company, saving an estimated 160 lives in the process. The war did not pause for award ceremonies. Manuel Perez Jr. continued fighting with Company A as the Battle for Manila raged through February and into March of 1945. The city that had been called the Pearl of the Orient was being reduced to rubble street by street, building by building. The Japanese defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew they were defeated but refused to surrender. American casualties mounted steadily. Every day brought new firefights, new casualties, new tactical problems that required solutions written in blood and explosive. On March 14, 1945, exactly 29 days after his assault on the pillbox at Fort William McKinley, Private First Class Manuel Perez Jr. was killed by a sniper while his unit was engaged in operations near Fort McKinley. 29 days, just under a month, long enough to believe you might survive the war. Long enough to write letters home talking about the future. Long enough to forget, for brief moments, that death could find you at any instant. The sniper's bullet, fired from concealment by an enemy soldier whose name no one would ever know, struck Manuel Perez Jr. and killed him almost instantly. He was 21 years old. He had survived the most dangerous assault of the Fort McKinley battle only to die on a random day in a random firefight, because war is indiscriminate and death does not respect heroism. The Medal of Honor was presented posthumously to Manuel Perez Sr., who received the decoration on behalf of his son in a ceremony that must have felt like the hollowest ceremony imaginable. What comfort is a medal when your child is dead? What meaning do words like valor and heroism have when the young man who embodied those qualities will never come home, never marry, never have children of his own, never fulfill the promise of his youth? Manuel Perez Sr. accepted the medal because it was what remained of his son's service, a physical object to represent a life that had been given in the belief that the cause was worth the sacrifice. But no parent wants a medal. Every parent wants their child to come home alive. Manuel Perez Jr. became the 7th Mexican-American to receive the Medal of Honor during World War II. 7 men from a community that faced discrimination and prejudice even as they served in disproportionate numbers. 7 men whose courage and sacrifice helped prove what should never have required proving, that Mexican Americans were every bit as capable, as brave, as dedicated as any other Americans. The medal itself was a recognition of individual heroism, but it carried weight far beyond one man's actions. It represented the service of all Mexican Americans who wore the uniform, who fought and bled and died for a country that did not always acknowledge them as full citizens. In the decades following World War II, Manuel Perez Jr.'s name would be memorialized in ways both large and small. Schools were named after him in Oklahoma and Texas, buildings where children would learn and grow and never know the weight of a rifle or the sound of machine gun fire. A chapel at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, was dedicated in his honor, a place of worship and reflection where soldiers could contemplate sacrifice and service. Parks in California and Oklahoma bore his name, green spaces where families could gather in peace bought by men like Perez who died in places far from home. These memorials served a purpose beyond simple remembrance. They were statements of value, declarations that Manuel Perez Jr.'s life and death mattered, that he represented something larger than himself. The tactical genius of Perez's assault on the Pillbox has been studied in military schools and used as an example of creative problem-solving under fire. The solution he devised, forcing defenders to choose between 2 threats and exploiting the blind spots in their defensive position, became a case study in thinking beyond standard tactics. Officers studying the battle at Fort William McKinley learned that sometimes the solution to an impossible problem requires seeing the situation differently, understanding that fortifications designed to keep attackers at a distance become vulnerable when someone closes to point-blank range. The pillbox that seemed impregnable from 40 yards away was fatally flawed when viewed from 20 yards. And Manuel Perez Jr. was the one who understood that geometric reality and had the courage to act on it. But beneath all the analysis and memorialization and historical study lies a simpler truth. A young man from Chicago who worked in a factory before the war used his intelligence and courage to save the lives of his fellow soldiers, and paid for that heroism with his own life 29 days later. He did not die in the moment of his greatest achievement. He died in an ordinary firefight, killed by an enemy he probably never saw, on a day that would have been forgotten if not for his previous actions. There is something especially tragic in that timing, something that speaks to the fundamental randomness of war. Survive the impossible assault, die to a sniper's bullet a month later. Come through the moment when you should have died a dozen times over, only to be killed when you thought the worst was behind you. The men of Company A who survived the war carried Manuel Perez Jr.'s story with them for the rest of their lives. They told their children and grandchildren about the day one man with a handful of grenades eliminated a position that had killed 12 of their friends and wounded 18 others. They described the 17-minute crawl across 40 yards of ground swept by machine gun fire. They recalled the 4 minutes of systematic destruction that broke the Japanese defensive line and allowed the company to achieve its objective. And they emphasized again and again that Manuel Perez Jr. had not been reckless or suicidal. He had been calculating and precise, a man who understood the geometry of violence and executed a plan that required perfect timing and absolute courage. The Medal of Honor citation for Private First Class Manuel Perez Jr. reads with the formal language characteristic of such documents, but between the bureaucratic phrasing lies the story of extraordinary heroism. The citation notes that Perez advanced alone across ground swept by enemy fire. It describes how he used grenades to neutralize the defensive position. It acknowledges that his actions saved the lives of his fellow soldiers and contributed significantly to the success of the mission. What the citation cannot fully convey is the weight of that 17-minute crawl, the split-second timing required to execute the grenade assault, the absolute focus necessary to move methodically through a situation where panic would be the natural response. The question of whether medals and memorials adequately honor sacrifice is one that has no satisfying answer. How do you measure the value of a life given in combat? How do you balance the recognition of heroism against the grief of those left behind? The Medal of Honor is the nation's highest military decoration, but it is still just a medal, a piece of metal on a ribbon that cannot bring back the dead or comfort the bereaved. The schools and chapels and parks named after Manuel Perez Jr. serve as reminders of his service, but they exist in a world he never got to see, visited by people who never knew him. The memorials are important because they resist forgetting, because they insist that some sacrifices must be remembered even decades later. But they are also inadequate because no memorial can truly capture what was lost when that sniper's bullet found its target on March 14, 1945. In the broader context of World War II, Manuel Perez Jr.'s story is one of millions. 16 million Americans served during the war. 405,000 of them did not come home. Each one of those deaths was a universe of potential unrealized, a future that would never happen, a family forever altered. The scale of loss in World War II is difficult to comprehend. We speak of casualty figures and percentages, but each number represents a person who lived and breathed and hoped and feared. Manuel Perez Jr. was one of 405,000, and his death was no more or less tragic than any other. What distinguishes his story is not that he died, but how he lived in those final weeks and days, and the specific actions that earned him recognition among millions of other brave soldiers. The Battle of Manila, in which Manuel Perez Jr. fought and died, was one of the most destructive urban battles of World War II. The city that had once been a jewel of colonial architecture and cultural fusion was reduced to ruins by the time the fighting ended. Over 100,000 Filipino civilians died in the battle, caught between Japanese defenders who used them as human shields and American attackers who had no choice but to blast through defensive positions with artillery and airstrikes. The fight for Fort William McKinley was a small piece of a larger catastrophe, a tactical necessity that contributed to strategic victory, but at a cost measured in thousands of lives and the destruction of an entire city. For the soldiers of the 11th Airborne Division, the battle for Fort McKinley represented the kind of close-quarters combat that tests men in ways that training can only approximate. The paratroopers had jumped into combat in the Pacific Theater knowing they were facing an enemy that did not surrender, that fought to the death in defensive positions, that considered surrender a dishonor worse than death itself. This knowledge shaped American tactics, creating a brutally efficient approach to combat that emphasized overwhelming firepower and aggressive assault. Manuel Perez Jr.'s method of destroying the Pillbox fit perfectly within that tactical framework. He did not offer the defenders a chance to surrender. He systematically killed them all because that was the only way to neutralize the position and save American lives. There is a moral complexity to combat that is difficult to discuss in the context of heroism and medal ceremonies. The same actions that save American lives necessarily involve taking enemy lives, often in ways that would be considered murder in any other context. Dropping grenades through firing ports into a confined space where men have no chance to escape or defend themselves is killing with absolute efficiency and no mercy. We honor such actions because they occurred in the context of war, because the alternative was watching more American soldiers die in futile attacks, because the Japanese defenders had already killed 12 men and would kill many more if allowed to continue. But the moral weight of that killing does not disappear simply because it was tactically necessary and strategically justified. The men Manuel Perez Jr. killed were enemy soldiers, but they were also human beings who died in terror and agony in the space of 4 minutes. This complexity does not diminish the heroism of Perez's actions. If anything, it makes that heroism more profound because it acknowledges the full reality of what combat demands. Heroes in war are not simply brave. They are willing to do terrible things in service of a larger purpose, to carry the psychological weight of violence for the rest of their lives, to make decisions that will haunt them even when those decisions were correct. Manuel Perez Jr. volunteered for the most dangerous assignment because he believed he had a solution that would save lives. He executed that solution with mechanical precision despite the moral weight of the violence involved. And he continued fighting for 29 more days until death found him, carrying whatever memories and nightmares the assault on the Pillbox had created. The men who served with Manuel Perez Jr. remembered him as quiet and competent, a soldier who did his job without complaint and without seeking attention. He was not the kind of man who told war stories or bragged about his accomplishments. He simply did what needed to be done and moved on to the next task. This character profile fits with the evidence of his actions at Fort William McKinley. The assault on the Pillbox was not the product of rage or recklessness. It was the work of a man who had identified a problem, devised a solution, and executed that solution with professional detachment. After the Pillbox fell and Company A moved forward, Perez returned to his position in the formation and continued serving as point man. The most extraordinary action of his life was treated as simply another day's work. If there is a lesson in Manuel Perez Jr.'s story beyond the obvious one about courage under fire, it is perhaps about the nature of problem-solving under pressure. The Pillbox at Fort William McKinley had stumped the officers planning the assault because they were thinking in terms of conventional tactics. Frontal assault had failed. Flanking was impossible due to mines. Suppressive fire was ineffective against the reinforced concrete. They were stuck in a pattern of thought that saw the Pillbox as an obstacle to be overcome through force. Manuel Perez Jr. saw it differently. He recognized that the Pillbox's strength was also its weakness, that the firing ports that allowed the defenders to kill attackers at a distance also created blind spots, that the reinforced walls that protected from external attack trapped the defenders inside with grenades, that the defensive position was actually a tomb waiting to be sealed. This shift in perspective, from seeing the Pillbox as a fortress to seeing it as a trap, was the key insight that made the assault possible. In the years immediately after World War II, as America celebrated victory and mourned its dead, stories like Manuel Perez Jr. served multiple purposes. They honored individual sacrifice. They demonstrated American fighting spirit. They showed that the war had been won by ordinary men who found extraordinary courage when circumstances demanded it. For Mexican-American communities, stories like Perez's had additional significance. They were evidence against discrimination, proof that Mexican-Americans had served with distinction, arguments for equal treatment that carried more weight than any political speech. If a Mexican-American factory worker from Chicago could earn the Medal of Honor by saving 160 American lives, how could anyone argue that Mexican-Americans were somehow less American, less capable, less worthy of full citizenship and equal rights? The posthumous nature of Manuel Perez Jr.'s Medal of Honor adds a layer of tragedy that is impossible to ignore. He never knew he would receive the nation's highest military decoration. He never stood in a ceremony while the medal was pinned to his uniform. He never heard his name read in citation or felt whatever mixture of pride and discomfort that Medal of Honor recipients often describe. He died believing he had been recommended for a Silver Star, which is itself an extraordinary honor, but he never knew that his actions would be judged worthy of the Medal of Honor. This is the reality for many recipients of the award. They do not survive to receive it. The medal goes to families who would trade every honor in the world for 5 more minutes with their loved one. The specific details of how Manuel Perez Jr. died are sparse in the historical record. He was killed by a sniper near Fort William McKinley on March 14, 1945. That is the extent of what official records tell us. We do not know what objective his unit was pursuing that day. We do not know whether he saw the sniper or if the shot came from complete concealment. We do not know if his death was instant or if he had time to know he was dying. We do not know if he thought about his family in Chicago, about the factory where he used to work, about the life he would never live. All we know is that 29 days after his greatest moment of heroism, Manuel Perez Jr.'s war ended on a hillside in the Philippines, and the world lost a young man whose potential would never be fully realized. Now 80 years removed from the events at Fort William McKinley, Manuel Perez Jr.'s story remains relevant not because it is unique, but because it is representative. Thousands of young men in World War II did extraordinary things in combat. Most of them were never recognized with medals or memorials. They simply did what needed to be done, survived or did not survive, and returned home to build lives in the shadow of experiences they rarely discussed. Manuel Perez Jr. was fortunate, if that is the right word, to have his actions witnessed and documented and judged worthy of the highest recognition. But he was also unlucky in the most fundamental way. He did not survive to see the end of the war or to benefit from the peace his sacrifice helped secure. If you found this story powerful and meaningful, I would ask you to take a moment to subscribe to this channel so you can hear more stories of courage and sacrifice from America's wars. If this account of Manuel Perez Jr.'s heroism moved you or taught you something about the reality of combat, please consider giving this video a like to help others discover this history. And I want to pose a question for you to consider and perhaps discuss in the comments. When we honor soldiers like Manuel Perez Jr. with medals and memorials decades after their deaths, are we truly honoring them, or are we honoring the ideals they represented?